This is the Lew Rockwell Show.
What a pleasure today to have Dr. Hans-Hermann Hoppe visiting with us. Dr. Hoppe is a senior fellow of the Mises Institute, was professor of economics at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, taught at Johns Hopkins at Bologna and other schools, the author of many papers, important books. But what I want to concentrate on today, Democracy, the God That Failed. It's a very controversial book. Hans argues that the political system that we're all taught from the earliest days in the government schools and taught by the government-connected media and the whole zeitgeist to worship, and I use that word advisedly, is the system of democracy. Hans argues that democracy is probably the worst form of government, and that the older form of government, monarchy, was much more limited, and the state was much more limited under a monarchical system. Hans, tell us a little bit about democracy and monarchy.
The first point that needs to be made is that states, whether monarchical states or democratic states, are not firms. They do not produce anything that is sold on the market and receive a payment for the goods that they produce, but they live off taxes which are coercive payments made to them. So I will neither advocate monarchies, nor am I an advocate of democracies, but if one has to choose between two evils, a monarchical state and a democratic state, then monarchies have certain advantages. The reason is that kings were generally perceived by the public for what they are, that is, privileged individuals who could tax their subjects, and because everybody knew I cannot become a king, there was resistance against attempts on the part of kings to increase taxes and to increase exploitation of their subjects. Under democracy, the illusion arises that we all rule ourselves, even though it should be perfectly clear, of course, that also under a democracy there exist rulers and people who are ruled, but because of the fact that everybody can potentially become a public employee, the illusion of we rule ourselves arises, and this then leads to a reduction of the resistance that existed vis-à-vis kings when it came to the attempt of increasing tax revenue. But there is an even more important disadvantage of democracy as compared to monarchy. One can imagine a king to be a person who regards the country as his private property and the people living in his country as his tenants, who pay some sort of rent to the king. On the other hand, if we have democratic politicians do not own the country as a king owns the country. They are temporary caretakers of the country for 4 years, 8 years, and so forth. And the role of an owner versus the role of a caretaker is very, very different. One can imagine, for instance, that I make somebody the owner of a house such that he can sell the house in the market, that he can determine who will be his successor, who will be his heir. And on the other hand, I give a house, the same kind of house, to somebody and make him for 4 years the caretaker of this house. That is, he cannot sell the house, he cannot determine who will be the heir, but he can make as much income out of using the house for a temporary period of time. And this will imply that the temporary caretaker will use up the capital value embodied in the country in as fast a time as possible, because after all, he does not have to bear the cost of capital consumption. After all, the house is not his, whereas a king, being the owner of the house, has a longer term perspective. He will not want to use up the value embodied in the house as quickly as possible. After all, that would be reflected in a lower price of the house or of the country, and that would be reflected, of course, in a lower value of property being passed on to the next generation. So a king has a long-run perspective, wants to preserve and possibly enhance the value of the country, whereas a democratic politician has a short-run orientation and wants to maximize his income as quickly as possible at the expense of losses in capital value.
Hans, one of the points that you made in your book, Democracy, the God That Failed, that most impressed me was the difference in wars waged under monarchs and under democracies, that there's a reason that monarchical wars tended to be what Mises described as soldiers' wars, whereas the democratic wars involved mass murders of civilians on a scale, of course, never before seen in human history.
And that, again, has something to do with the fact that monarchs considered countries as their property, and the reason for going to war, typically property disputes. Do I own this castle or does somebody else own this castle? Do I own this province or does somebody else own this province? The objective was always limited, whereas democratic wars tend to be ideological wars. You want to liberate a country, you want to convert them to a different ideology, and it is difficult to determine when you have actually achieved this goal. The only sure way to determine is if you kill the entire population of the country that you try to invade or occupy, whereas a monarch, of course, would never have this interest. After all, he wants to add a certain province, a certain town, a certain castle to his own private estate, and wants to cause as little damage as possible. So for monarchs it was easy to begin a war, but it was always also very easy to determine when their objective had been reached and the war came to an end. There was never any ideological motivation why different kings went to war against each other, whereas under democracies, similar to religious wars, it is a clash of civilizations, a clash of value systems, and that makes it almost impossible to ever come to an end in wars. And in addition, because kings' wars were considered to be kings' wars by the public, kings had to rely by and large on volunteers fighting their wars, whereas under democracies, the entire country goes to war and all the resources of the entire country then can be dedicated to the war. And typically with democracy came also the draft. In the United States nowadays we do not have a draft, but the typical situation for democracies is, of course, we do have a draft. People can be drawn into the war and forced into the war with the argument that now you have a stake in the war under democracy, and now that you have a stake in the state, you must also fight the wars of the state, whereas under monarchy, people did not have a stake in the state. The state was considered to be the king's state. The public was an entirely different entity from the state, and because of that, their involvement in the war was very limited.
Hans, the late Erich von Knut-Ledeen, who we both had the honor of knowing, used to point out that one of the things he liked about monarchical government was that it was much less nationalism. Nationalism, of course, a feature of the 20th century and the 21st century, and that nobody thought there was anything wrong with, say, a German nobleman going into the employ of the Tsarina of Russia, or people fighting on various sides. They weren't considered traitors, quote unquote. But of course, we've had this consonant with the rise in democracy, the rise in this very belligerent and unfortunate philosophy of nationalism.
The high aristocracy is, so to speak, the most international group of people. Almost all high noblemen are intermarried, interrelated with noblemen in other countries. And the German Kaiser was related to the British rulers and to the Russian rulers. Knut-Ledeen even pointed out that all ruling houses in Europe were also related in some indirect way to Muhammad, that is, to the Islamic countries. And because those were family feuds, so to speak. A feeling of nationalism was something impossible for them to arise because they themselves were in the most international class of people around. So nationalistic feelings were entirely strange and unusual for a class such as that.
Let me mention that two of Eric von Knut-Ludin's books are published by the Mises Institute. If you take a look at Mises.org and look at the store, also publishers of course, Hans's books. And take a look at his archive also on LewRockwell.com. Just go to columnists and then to Hoppe. Very much worth reading. You can click on his books at the bottom. And the one we've been talking about today is Democracy, the God That Failed, is one of those books that is actually almost life-changing. You will never look again at the world in the same way after you read this book. And I heartily recommend that you do. And Dr. Hoppe, thanks very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Lew Rockwell Show. Produced by LewRockwell.com, the best-read libertarian website in the world. If you'd like to advertise on this podcast or on the website, email advertise@LewRockwell.com. And thanks for listening.